How did a dismounted and logistically challenged force with minimal air support outmaneuver UN forces in North Korea in 1950? We look at Chinese deception planning then and now.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 92 of the Principles of War podcast. This is the second part of our series looking at deception and self-deception on the Yalu River in 1950. It's a particularly interesting case because there was Chinese strategic messaging aimed at deterring US involvement in North Korea. When it became clear that that had failed, the PLA then started operational deception planning in order to achieve surprise against the UN forces on the Yalu River. Even after the Chinese started moving forces across the Yalu River, Marshal Peng, the commander of the Chinese People's Volunteers, was able to deceive the UN in order to enable enough time to build up the 11 armies that he was moving across the Yalu River to set the conditions for an advance that would see them reclaim all of North Korea. Exactly how could this have been done? Particularly when the US forces in North Korea at the time had such a technological overmatch when it came to ISR and intelligence gathering capabilities. There tends to be a perception that the Chinese forces, their way of fighting, was an unknown quantity in 1950, particularly from the point of view of the United States. But nothing could be further from the truth. Since 1900, during the Boxer Rebellion, all the way through to 1949, the US Army had had a continual presence in China. In November 1945, Zhou Enlai requested from General George C. Marshall support in training 2 communist divisions. Zhou Enlai would go on to be the first premier of the People's Republic of China, and his communications would be part of the strategic messaging to the United States about their concerns about advances over the 38th parallel. American officers had served next to Mao for 2 years with the Dixie mission in Yan'an, starting in August of 1944. The last general officer advisor to the Chinese Nationalist Army, which was David Barr, would be the commander of the 7th Infantry Division in Korea during the conflict. So the United States was not fighting an enemy of which it had no knowledge. It had been working with it for a long time, and it had been working with it during combat with the Japanese. The communists had been fighting on 2 fronts. They'd been fighting the nationalist Chinese and the Japanese. And it was during these battles that they mastered the capability of mobility and camouflage that they would use with such great skill during their advance through North Korea. The US Army had seen them and their capability for creating ambushes, the way that they would move to encircle an enemy, and in particular, the way that they used deception at a tactical and operational level. During the war with the Japanese, the predecessors of the PLA had worked to develop march discipline, the capability to move long distances very quickly, considering the fact that they were unmotorized, as well as a porter system to support those forces as they moved. One PLA army was able to move 286 miles or 460 kilometers from Manchuria into the combat zone in less than 19 days. It had one division that moved 18 miles per day for 18 days. This capability was completely underestimated by MacArthur's intelligence team. And because of that, when the PLA had 300,000 troops in the AO, MacArthur thought that it was only between 50 to 60,000 troops that they had. How could MacArthur fail to pick up 300,000 Chinese troops on the DPRK border? This is a failure of operational and strategic intelligence. Let's have a look at what MacArthur should have known. Firstly, we've got the Republic of China. These are the national forces who have moved to Taiwan. They're still at war with the People's Republic of China. And in fact, MacArthur had a meeting with Chiang Kai-shek. It's likely that Humint would have been passed from the Republic of China to MacArthur. He would have known that there were grave concerns within the Communist Party about United States actions, UN actions in North Korea. Whaley, in his book, describes the information that was available to MacArthur. The warnings, some real and some explicit, some real but obscure, and some fancied, of possible Chinese intervention fall into two quite distinct periods. The first period began with the sudden and successful US leap to aid the invaded South Korea in June 1950. It was characterized by two types of Chinese warnings. One group comprised of many frequent and quite explicit declarations by senior officials that China did not intend to permit the total defeat of its fraternal communist regime in North Korea. The only ambiguity, if that is even the word, is that these statements did not specify the precise nature of Chinese counteraction, although it seemed clearly implied that this would take some military form. In any case, their threatening tone varied directly with the degree of physical threat to the North Korean regime. The more important warnings of Chinese intent were the following. On the 20th of August, Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai wired the UN that the Chinese people cannot but be concerned about solution of the Korean question. Then, on the 22nd of September, a Foreign Ministry spokesman publicly confirmed MacArthur's charge of the 18th that the Chinese People's Liberation Army had transferred a division of ethnically Korean troops to North Korea shortly before the outbreak of war. To this provocative admission, the spokesman added that the Chinese people will always stand on the side of the Korean people. 3 days later, on the 25th, the acting chief of staff of the PLA, General Nia Jung-chen, informally told the Indian ambassador, K.M. Panikia, that China would not sit back with folded hands and let the Americans come up to the border. This was a virtual ultimatum, and the fact that it was informal and delivered privately shows that it was not intended as mere grandstand international propaganda, but served some other quite serious purpose. In case the informality was distrusted, Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai broadcast an official statement on the 30th of September that the Chinese people would not supinely tolerate seeing their neighbours being savagely invaded by the imperialists. Then, on the 3rd of October, he reinforced this and spelled it out privately but formally, telling Ambassador Panikia most explicitly that China would directly intervene should US or UN, as opposed to South Korean, forces cross the 38th parallel into North Korea. Panikia promptly informed his government, which passed the ultimatum to both the US government and the UN Secretary General, and MacArthur was soon notified. And on the 10th of October, Radio Peking made a declaration of intentions similar to that of Zhou Enlai. Amidst a number of warnings that were now pouring in from covert intelligence sources, one is worth particular mention. Early in October, an escaped American officer informed MacArthur's G2 that on the 22nd of September, during his interrogation in North Korea by 3 Soviet, potentially KGB officers, one asserted that if US troops crossed the 38th parallel, new communist forces would enter the war. Throughout this period, Soviet-Russian propaganda, official statements and diplomacy paralleled those of Red China, albeit in a more subdued key. Thus, while Stalin was fully supportive of his Chinese ally, he was clearly prepared to let them take the lead and its rewards or punishments in this international adventure. Whaley continues, unfortunately, the Americans mistook the very real Chinese and Russian warnings as sheer bluff. Their hunter's blood was up and neither MacArthur nor the UN would be denied. On October 7th, both crossed the metaphorical Rubicon. MacArthur geographically and the UN General Assembly politically by passing the resolution recommending that all appropriate steps be taken to ensure conditions of stability throughout Korea. As late as the 14th of October, the Far East Command Daily Intelligence Summary went on the record with the estimate, recent declarations by Chinese communist leaders threatening to enter North Korea if American forces were to cross the 38th parallel are probably in a category of diplomatic blackmail. The second type of warnings that Whaley looks at in his book is the movements of PLA divisions to the China-North Korea border, the Yalu River. These indications are important for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it backs up the stated intent of intervening militarily in the conflict, but it also gives them the capability to be able to do that. There was no public announcement of this, but it was assumed that the United States would learn of such large troop movements. It's very difficult to keep them hidden. And indeed, there may have been ambivalence on the behalf of the Chinese if the US did learn of it, because of the fact that it would have made their declarations of support for the DPRK seem more valid. Prior to the actual intervention in mid-October, the CCP was openly messaging warnings through a number of channels. There were also unconcealed preparations for intervention should it be required. Whaley writes that the Chinese government was openly and sincerely seeking to prevent the escalation of war. Once they crossed the Yalu in force, there was a change in posture. Whilst the PLA was openly positioned in Manchuria, they took a range of actions to hide the development of the CPV in North Korea. Careful and deliberate movement of troops were conducted in order to avoid US aerial reconnaissance. There was no movement during the day, and in fact troops were hidden during those times. Movement only occurred at night time. Despite the fact that UN forces received a range of warnings from not only North Korean prisoners but also civilians that there were large numbers of Chinese forces across the Yalu, these reports were discounted because of the inability to verify them with aerial reconnaissance. This March discipline meant that by the time that Marshal Peng commenced his second campaign, which is the main offensive on the 24th of November, not only did its occurrence come as a surprise, but also the force with which it came. And MacArthur had underestimated the number of troops by a factor of 4. From the crossing of the Yalu through till the end of the war, the Chinese government maintained the fiction that the forces fighting were the Chinese People's Volunteers. None of the CPV members carried identity cards. The PLA realised that eventually it would be known that there had been a Chinese intervention. So once the fact that it had occurred had been learnt, they were keen to maintain the deception around the strength of that intervention. Whaley describes the mechanisms used by the PLA to do this. The stratagem employed to this end was the simple one of assigning code designations to each unit. These not only masked their original Chinese unit designation, thereby muddying UNC G2 efforts to track the shift of PLA/CPV units from China to Manchuria to Korea, but downgraded the size of the units. Thus, the PLA 38th Army became the CPV 54th Unit. The 115th Division of the 39th Army became the 1st Battalion 55th Unit, and so on. The first Chinese prisoners, 4 of them, were captured along the line on the 25th of October. Despite the prisoners' own willing efforts to correct the error, 8th Army Intelligence insisted on treating these units as small detachments rather than as a 30,000-man army. And as late as the 5th of November, by which time about 100 Chinese had been taken, 8th Army G2 was still only willing to grant divisional status to the Chinese units, thus underestimating their strength by a factor of 3. On the 24th of November, Walton Walker's 8th Army went on the offensive. However, they didn't have the force ratios required to continue the advance. And within 2 days, the offensive had been stopped, and by D+4, they were in full retreat. Whaley continues the story. The catastrophe at the Yalu was a great embarrassment to MacArthur and his G2, Major General Willoughby, as well as to the various military units there. This circumstance probably accounts for the lack of casualty reporting in the official sources, despite the fact that the data exists. For example, the destruction of the Turkish brigade, for which the US secretly apologised to an astonished Turkish government, is entirely glossed over. And the widely quoted total loss of 13,000 troops reported by Willoughby conveniently overlooks both ROK and UN losses. This is interesting as we see the transition from strategic messaging, whereby the Chinese government is attempting to deter non-ROK forces from crossing the 38th parallel, through to the implementation of strong operational security. That OPSEC generating the EFIs, the essential elements of friendly information, that the Chinese want to deny to the United States and UN intelligence organizations, particularly the fact that Chinese troops are in North Korea and the number of those troops that are there. From the United States point of view, we see a massive strategic intelligence failure. What was going on within his G2 or his intelligence shop? What were the problems that they had there? There's a significant number of them. Firstly, we see hubris. We've already discussed how the Red Army, now the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, had a large amount of operational experience ranging from guerrilla warfare all the way up to multiple army groups involving hundreds of thousands of troops. The PLA had a way of war which was known to the United States. Senior US officers had worked with both the National Army and the Communist Army during World War II. However, all of this information was either unknown or discounted by Willoughby, the Major General in charge of intelligence for MacArthur. Either way, it's no excuse. If he didn't know, he could have asked people who had been with the Chinese. He could have found out this is not hidden information. The second issue is willful self-deception. MacArthur had decided that the Chinese would not attack. What was this decision based on? It could be that this was his genuine appreciation of the situation, that he didn't think the Chinese had the capability or intent to intervene. Or it could just be that the risk of Chinese intervention was just something that he didn't want to hear. Remember, Truman had instructed him to continue if there was no risk of Chinese intervention. And it seems like he was quite keen to push all the way to the Yalu River to destroy the DPRK government, to unify North and South Korea. Oh, what songs they would have sung about him had he been able to achieve that feat. Bruce Riedel wrote a book, JFK's Forgotten Crisis, Tibet, the CIA and the Sino-Indian War. I'm going to read a short passage from that because it highlights one of the big issues that we have in intelligence appreciation in Korea. MacArthur had always understood that if you control intelligence, you control decision-making. He had built an intelligence community in his area of command that listened attentively to what he wanted and gave him intelligence that reinforced his already held views. MacArthur wanted total control of the war and its execution, not second-guessing by his subordinates or outside interference by Washington, especially by the White House and the Pentagon. If his Tokyo command headquarters were solely responsible for collecting and assessing intelligence on the enemy, then MacArthur alone could decide how big the enemy threat was and what to do about it. MacArthur's authority put America's relatively new civilian intelligence agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, in an awkward position. It was not permitted to have a representative in Tokyo or participate in preparing intelligence estimates for the 8th Army. During World War II, MacArthur had done the same thing, excluding the CIA's predecessor, the Office of Strategic Services, from his Southwest Pacific Command. MacArthur, who had never spent a single night during the war in Korea, preferring to sleep in his headquarters in Japan, wanted no outside intelligence challenger. As one historian of the war wrote later, only after the great and catastrophic failure on the whereabouts and intentions of China's armies would the CIA finally be allowed into the region. There we see MacArthur, a big believer in knowledge is power, restricting the ability of other organisations to gather intelligence in his AO. This means that there is no independent check on the thinking that is going on in his intelligence headquarters. The Lieutenant Colonel, who was the G3 or the operations officer for 10th Corps, wrote that MacArthur did not want the Chinese to enter the war in Korea. Anything MacArthur wanted, Willoughby produced intelligence for. In this case, Willoughby falsified the intelligence reports. He should have gone to jail. There's a very interesting quote about MacArthur and intelligence, and that is, expect only 5% of an intelligence report to be accurate. The trick of a good commander is to isolate the 5%. Now, either willingly or unwillingly, MacArthur accepted the reports that he was getting from Willoughby and acted accordingly based on those reports. So, by his own definition, not a great commander because he absolutely failed to be able to pick the 5% out of his intelligence report. You'd like to think, though, that a really good intelligence officer would be able to produce a report that has more than 5% of its content as being accurate. I've got another interesting MacArthur quote for you. There have been 3 great intelligence officers in history. Mine is not one of them. John Ferris, in his book Intelligence and Strategy, calls this an understatement and states that Willoughby is a candidate for one of the 3 worst intelligence officers of the Second World War. So this brings us to the next problem that we have with deception and self-deception on the Yalu River. MacArthur should have had a better G2. It was his role to build his staff. That staff would have supported his decision-making and ensure that his orders were promulgated and followed. When we look at staff development for a senior officer, I think back to Montgomery at 2nd LL. He got Freddie de Guingand as his chief of staff. He stayed with him for the rest of the war. He got Sidney Kirkman as his Commander Royal Artillery. He stayed with him for the rest of the war. He built a staff around him that was going to be able to work, that understood how he worked, and that would have harmony within the headquarters. This did not occur with MacArthur. In this, I'm reminded of Commander Ralph Seymour. He was the flag lieutenant to Admiral Sir David Beatty. During the Battle of Dogger Bank and the Battle of Jutland, it was Seymour's job to turn Beatty's orders into instructions that would be sent by flags. That was why he was the flag lieutenant. During both battles, he sent flag messages that were so inept that they were considered to have diminished the British victories. Beatty remained loyal to him through the war, but after the war, there was an analysis of Jutland where Beatty's performance was called into question and he became increasingly negative about Seymour's performance. It's quite a tragic story. Seymour suffered a nervous breakdown and ended up committing suicide by jumping off Black Rock in Brighton because of the way that he'd been treated. I don't believe that this is Commander Seymour's fault. He actually hadn't done the flag signalling course, so he was unqualified to do it. And Beatty had retained him despite the fact that he wasn't capable of doing the job. MacArthur did the same thing with Willoughby. Or did he? Was it the fact that Willoughby was a yes man? Willoughby would produce the intelligence report that he wanted to see rather than the intelligence report that he needed to see. Either way, we see strong tactical and operational deception measures having a devastating impact for operational planning for the UN forces in North Korea. The fact that Willoughby never produced a report that highlighted the risk from Chinese intervention meant that there was never the development of a most dangerous course of action. Military planning will often look at what the enemy is going to do and break it down into 2 courses of action, the most likely and the most dangerous. It wasn't that hard to divine what the most dangerous course of action the enemy could have taken in North Korea. It would be the Chinese invading. How do we know that? Because the Chinese said that they would militarily intervene if UN forces crossed the 38th parallel. So we're given the most dangerous course of action. Not hard to divine. What should then have occurred is MacArthur, or more likely Willoughby, should have ensured that ISR assets, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, those assets should have been positioned so that they could look for that most dangerous course of action. MacArthur, despite his ego, despite his hubris, should have then had a contingency plan. If the Chinese do invade, then we are going to do this. If he'd done that, they wouldn't have been caught flat-footed. They wouldn't have had to retreat all the way back to the 37th parallel. Lastly, we want to think about strategic warning time. Was there ever a desire by the United States to defend South Korea should North Korea decide to reunify the 2 Koreas by use of military force? If there was, what was the process around force design, force readiness to ensure that that was capable of being done? On the 12th of January 1950, the American Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, gave a speech where he listed the countries in America's sphere of influence. The Republic of Korea was not mentioned. Was this omission what gave North Korea the impetus to attempt military reunification? The ambiguity of America's attitude towards developments in mainland Asia created a strategic opportunity for Kim, and he was able to push this opportunity with his allies in Moscow and Beijing. After that statement in January, the United States started to look a lot more closely at communist expansionism and decided that North Asia was an area of interest for it. However, intelligence did not pick up the risk that the United States was now running in North Korea. Babb, in Weaving a Tangled Web, describes the implications. About 2 months later, on the 25th of June 1950, the armed forces of the DPKR, with the acquiescence of the Soviet Union and China, attacked south to unite the peninsula under communist rule. As outlined in T.R. Fehrenberg's classic account, This Kind of War, a Study in Unpreparedness, the United States was not ready, as a nation or as a military, for a major conflict to contain communism, especially in Asia. The vast majority of America's ground troops in the theatre had spent most of the post-war period conducting occupation duties in Japan. These units were under strength, poorly equipped, and in a small garrison with few training opportunities for large-scale exercises due to the lack of manoeuvre areas in occupied Japan. The United States, as with all of the countries post-World War II, were running down their militaries in an effort to provide resources and funds to rebuild economies, buildings, infrastructure following the war. However, the end of the war did not see the end of threats of potential conflicts, particularly with the Soviet Union and the conflict between the nationalists and the communists within China and North and South Korea. Babb writes that no one in the Far East or in Washington comprehended the full extent of the strategic and operational risk of the Truman administration's consistent application of austerity measures to the national defense budget. The application of Chinese deception and the failures of United States intelligence resulted in one of the longest retreats in American history. It provides a range of lessons and examples in deception from the tactical, operational, and strategic levels. The fact that UN forces were deceived so comprehensively is particularly troubling, given that they were fighting an enemy whose basic tenet of war was unambiguously stated in 500 BC. All warfare is based on deception. Looking at the lessons, we can see that there was poor strategic messaging that enabled North Korean aggression to South Korea, not linking strategic warning time to force readiness, the failure of strategic intelligence to correctly assess the risk from North Korea, hubris, with MacArthur never correctly assessing the capabilities or the intent of the Chinese, self-deception. MacArthur had his own design and he wouldn't allow the enemy to intervene. The failure to develop a most dangerous course of action and assign the appropriate ISR assets to provide the warning of that most dangerous course of action. And lastly, the staffing. Poorly trained intelligence skills across the army, exacerbated by the poor choice of a G2 in Major General Willoughby. Two things before we finish up. We want to look at contemporary Chinese deception thinking, and we want to understand what the Magruder Principle is. Firstly, the Magruder Principle, named after Confederate General John Bankhead Magruder. Magruder has been described as having quite a theatrical bearing, and he lived like a grand seigneur on a line officer's pay. He would often go to extreme measures to create the appearance of a lavish lifestyle. This may be why he was quite adept at conducting deception operations. In April 1862, he was given the role of delaying George B. McClellan's Army of the Potomac. McClellan had 55,000 Federals, and Magruder only had 13,500 men with which to delay him. Major General Keyes, the commander of the Union 4th Corps, had his advance halted by an unexpected turn of the Warwick River. The maps back in those days weren't that reliable. Magruder found himself responsible for defending a 14-mile segment of the river with just those 13,500 men. He was able to construct plenty of defensive positions, he just didn't have the soldiers to man them. So he undertook a deception campaign. He marched troops up and down the line repeatedly, often the same troops. When they arrived in a position, there would be a lot of cheering, a lot of noise and commotion to create the impression that reinforcements had arrived. Quaker guns were placed in the defensive positions. A Quaker gun is actually a log painted black to appear as if to be a cannon, reinforcing the dominant narrative that Magruder's trying to put in Keyes' mind that the position is strongly defended and that it shouldn't be attacked. Army Field Manual 3-13.4, Army Support to Military Deception, describes the Magruder principle as thus. Magruder's principle states that it is generally easier to induce the deception target to maintain a pre-existing belief than to deceive the deception target for the purpose of changing that belief. Magruder's principle exploits target biases and the human tendency to confirm existing beliefs. Magruder's principle alludes to two paths: a path of the deceiver changing the belief of a target, and a path of maintaining a present belief. The principle then advises the better of the two paths. In using Magruder's principle, military deception officers provide the targeted decision makers with information that reinforces their expectations for what they believe to be true. This reinforces the target's pre-existing perceptions. Any bias is potentially exploitable. Most targets are unaware of how deeply their biases influence their perceptions and decisions. Most people resist letting go of existing options and tend to seek information that reinforces their own bias. An example of this principle occurred with the selection of the invasion site and its cover plan for the D-Day invasion of France. Using reconnaissance and communication intercepts, the Allies learned that Hitler and his senior military advisors believed that the most likely place for the Allied invasion would be in the Pas-de-Calais region. This was a viable plan as it provided better air cover and a shorter transit time from England. In fact, it was a reverse of their plan to invade England in 1940. The Allies were able to exploit and reinforce the enemy's expectations to the extent that the Germans had a difficult time reacting to the actual landings in Normandy. The field manual goes on to talk about multiple forms of surprise. A strong correlation exists between deception and surprise. The more forms of surprise built into the deception plan, the more likely it will overwhelm the target. These forms of surprise include size, activity, location, unit, time, equipment, intent, and style. One effect of surprise is the cry wolf syndrome, in which repeated false alarms have the potential to desensitize an enemy. A pattern of behavior lulls an opponent into a sense of normal behavior to allow a friendly action to occur without an immediate counteraction. An example occurred when Egypt successfully deceived Israel into a false sense of security in 1973 by mobilizing reservists 23 times before actually acting. Many times over 1 year, the same source provided information that the war would break out on a specific date. Each time, that day would come and go without an attack. This happened so often that when the source actually provided the date of the real attack, no one believed him. Lastly, we want to look at contemporary Chinese thoughts on deception operations. We'll quickly just go through the PLA principles of war, and these are based on People's War, originally written by Mao Zedong during the Long March in 1934-35. They were revised during the Japanese occupation, and they've been revised from time to time. They are: eliminate isolated pockets of the enemy before concentrating to fight larger forces, capture small villages and towns before capturing large urban areas, eliminate the enemy's fighting capacity, do not focus on territory, fight no battle unprepared, develop strategy based on the worst conditions, concentrate forces to achieve an overwhelming advantage in numbers, then defeat the enemy in detail, choose the first battle carefully, unify the command and coordinate, combine mobile war, positional war, and guerrilla war, employ forces and tactics flexibly, fight in one's own way and let the enemy fight in its. From a deception point of view, the main one is concentrate forces to achieve an overwhelming advantage in numbers, then defeat the enemy in detail. This is similar to the Western principle of concentration. However, it reflects the importance of numerical advantage. This principle is most often seen in PLA tactics, Tactical level units seek to use a combination of maneuver and deception to achieve their desired numerical superiority and allow engagement and defeat of the enemy in detail. Traditionally, the PLA has sought to fight using close combat techniques, taking advantage of night operations to enable infiltration wherever possible. Technological advances changed this approach, incorporating longer-range weapons and non-lethal effects to strike the enemy at greater distances, decreasing the effects of the technological gaps the PLA faces with regard to night vision and electro-optical capabilities. The principle that looks to combine mobile war, positional war, and guerrilla war talks about how mobile units use a combination of maneuver and deception to achieve surprise, indecisive actions. The next mention of deception is in China's approach to conflict. There are three aspects: comprehensive national power, the three warfares, and deception. Just quickly, the three warfares: public opinion warfare, psychological warfare, and legal warfare. Comprehensive national power is the whole of government approach. It comprises hard and soft power, so we're thinking DIME, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. What differentiates China with their comprehensive national power approach is the fact that comprehensive national power is one of only three aspects that they use to develop their approach to conflict. Some Western powers struggle to get a whole-of-government approach, particularly on the spectrum of conflict. This is where we see that grey zone really playing out. Lastly, deception. The ATP describes this as deception plays a critical role in every part of the Chinese approach to conflict. The Chinese emphasis on deception can be traced to Sun Tzu, who believed that it was the basis of all warfare. PLA views on this topic differ considerably from those of most Western militaries. Instead of being a peripheral enabler, deception operations are seen as integral to every operation at all levels of war. Where the US Army operational planning uses the concept of a course of action, a scheme developed to accomplish a mission, PLA planners use stratagems. Rather than describing friendly operations, stratagems describe the enemy's mindset, focusing on how to achieve the desired perceptions by the opponent and then prescribing ways to exploit this perception. Rather than focusing on defeating the opponent in direct conflict, as most Western militaries do, stratagems consider deceptions, trickery, and other indirect, perception-based efforts to be the most important elements of an operation. Deception is a fundamental aspect of the Chinese way of war, and applications of deception are considered a high priority. When it comes to tactical information operations, the PLA, in keeping with the teachings of Sun Tzu, considers information operations to be at least as important, if not more important, than maneuver or firepower. Deception, trickery, and concealment are to be employed extensively throughout the information operations campaign in order to manipulate the enemy commander's state of mind, the morale of the enemy troops, and the enemy's understanding of the battlefield to the PLA's advantage. Looking at psychological warfare tactics, deception is the activity at the heart of psychology of conviction attacks. Practically every PLA operation places a high premium on deceiving the enemy as it does maneuver or firepower. Attacks against psychology of conviction target the enemy's fighting spirit, will, and morale. At political echelons, this involves broad campaigns to convince or coerce enemy civilians and politicians to abandon support for the conflict. At tactical levels, the PLA takes a notably Marxist approach. It seeks to create division between lower ranks and senior ranks by encouraging anti-war sentiments, homesickness, and the fear among enemy soldiery. Another thing that differentiates the PLA is the size of their security forces, their paramilitaries, and they have a role in deception actions. The PLA also envisions its security units contributing to ground actions through deception, primarily through the use of feint actions. Security forces, particularly armed police, are well suited to missions of this type due to their high density of light, mobile armoured vehicles, and the ability to move quickly through a variety of different terrain types. 5 different forms of feint are envisaged for security forces. A feint movement. A security force moves in such a way that it deceives the enemy into thinking a larger army movement is occurring. Feint assembly. The security force simulates a more powerful ground force assembling on the ground for an offensive action. A feint attack. A security force conducts an actual limited attack on an enemy position. Feint defense. A security force conducts a limited or simulated defense against an attacking enemy. And a feint withdrawal. A security force pretends to be a larger force withdrawing from the battlefield. All of these measures are supported with false intelligence, including fake radio traffic. Their general intent is to fool the enemy reconnaissance surveillance assets into thinking that the security unit is actually a mechanized or armored friendly unit and to manipulate them into acting a certain way due to this misbelief. This, in turn, puts actual main body forces on the offensive, knowing that the enemy has been fooled and in pursuing an action against a deception unit. Commanders must remember, however, that security forces are not equipped to operate in close quarters with enemy heavy forces and should strive to protect their assigned security forces during deception actions. There's lots more in there, but I've tried to pick out the key ones that I think would be interesting to look at from a future operations point of view. This is a really interesting manual. There's lots of detailed information about a military that has a very different way of fighting, and I think there's lots that can be learned from that. So there you have it. We've looked at deception, surprise, and poor intelligence functions and how they all came together to create the issues that occurred for the United Nations Command in North Korea, just south of the Yalu River. I finished up with the contemporary Chinese tactics because I think it's really important to see the way that they embed deception into their operations at a much more organic level rather than what happens often in Western operations is that they are just added in as an afterthought. As we know from 2nd LLMA, it is possible to conceive an operation that starts with deception. We saw the results from Op Bertram and the way that they supported Op Lightfoot. I think there's something in there that we can all take away. That's enough deception for one podcast episode, I reckon. So if you've got anything out of this, please recommend this to a friend. If you're using it in your PME program, please let us know. I really like hearing from the militaries around the world who are looking at individual episodes or series.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos, and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.